This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
As we mentioned, according to Minhag Ashkenaz, there are 45 Kinnus that are part of the liturgy of Tisha B'Av. Many of the Kinnus are very difficult to understand because of their structure, because of their language. The Torah writes in Siman Tov Kuf Nun Tes that the whole congregation needs to understand them. Women, children, even the young boys, and therefore for the sake of greater understanding and to enhance the meaning of our Tisha B'Av service, we're going to be selecting specific Kinnus to recite, to focus on, paying attention to the historical background and some of the key phrases. We should know, though, that even if you don't understand the meaning of the words of the Kinnus, the words themselves carry tremendous Kedusha. Perhaps the most well-known of all the Paitanim, the most well-known of all the authors of Kinnus was Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir, who is considered the father of the Paitanim. He's the author of the first 15 Kinnus that we say today, and many of the tefillos that we say throughout the year. The Shibbolei Haleket brings a tradition that Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir, when he composed one of the piyutim, a heavenly fire encircled him. In fact, Mahari Hertz writes that when Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir wanted to compose the piyutim, he uttered various shemos, he ascended to the heaven, and the angel Michael taught Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir how to compose the Kinnus. Now, Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir was certainly an awesome personality, but there is a degree of uncertainty regarding exactly who Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir was. Tosfos in Masechta Chagiga and Daf Yud Gimel identifies Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir as none other than Rabbi Eliezer Reb Shimon, the son of Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. The Rashba, in the Tshuvas HaRashba, Siman Tov Samach Tes, identifies Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir as a great Tana, Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. So whether we understand the words, we have to understand that each word of the Kinnah is latent with great spiritual power. We begin the Kinnahs with Kinnah Vav, Shavas. Shavas, Mesois Libenu, Shavas, which means everything came to a standstill. Everything stopped, suddenly, unexpectedly. Rav Soloveitchik explains that sometimes people have an intuitive recognition that tragedy is imminent, and that helps a person psychologically prepare their minds for the upcoming tragedy. However, the Mekainen Rabbi Eliezer HaKalir expresses that the tragedy of the Churban was not just that it happened, but Shavas, that it happened suddenly, without any preparation. Yeah, the people were warned there's going to be Churban, but they didn't believe it. They didn't expect it to happen. They woke up in the morning and lo and behold, the Beis HaMikdash was no longer. The Beis HaMikdash was gone. Yerushalayim was destroyed, and they were being taken into Galus. Even Yirmiyah himself, who prophesied about the upcoming disaster, even he experienced the suddenness of the Churban. Hashem commanded Yirmiyah to go to Anasais. By the way, the Seder HaDoyer says the word Eicha is a Rashi Tevos. Ani, Yirmiyah, Kohen, Ha'anasais. I, Jeremiah, the prophet from Anasais. He was commanded to go there to buy a field from his uncle, and when he left, the Beis HaMikdash was standing, and the column of smoke was going straight up, and the Kohanim were bringing the karbanos. And Yirmiyah came back, and the Beis HaMikdash was gone, and the smoke was gone, and there was no building. Let's take a look at the 8th line in the Kinnah. The Mekainen, the lamenter says, Eini chiksa lachazoin ben berechia. My eye longs for the vision of Zechariah ben Berechia. Like we read in the Navi Zechariah, Yeshvu, Zekenim, Uzekenois, Berchovos Yushalayim, the Navi Zechariah prophesied. Elderly men and women will sit in the streets of Yushalayim, V'ish min shantoi biyadoi meirov yamim. Each man with his staff in his hand due to old age. Berchovos hayir yimalu, Yiladim v'yiladois mesachakim berchovos seha. Eini chiksa L'chazoin ben berechia. We longingly look forward to that prophecy. If we look on the 13th line, on the bottom, Al Pnei Paras Nupsu Chasideha. At the Euphrates River, her pious ones were mutilated. This refers to when the Jewish people were being exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. And the well-known Nevi'im were being carried off. And Nebuchadnezzar commanded the Levi'im to serenade him. Shiru lanu mishir tzion. Sing to us from the songs of Zion. Serenade us while we gloat over our victory. Whereupon the Levi'im hung up their instruments and they bit off their thumbs. They mutilated their thumbs, making it impossible to sing any songs. They didn't say Loi nashir asher Hashem. They said Eich nashir asher Hashem. How can we sing with mutilated thumbs? So we like to say over from our favorite Masechta Yevamos, Daf Pei Vav, where Tosfos brings down on Divrei Hamaschil Umibnei Levi Lo Matzasi Sham. Tosfos is bothered that in the times of the second Beis Hamikdash, it says Ezra came back and he could not find any Levium. There were no Levium returned in times of the second Beis Hamikdash. So Tosfos says actually there were Levium. There were no young Levium. The only Levium that returned in the times of the second Beis Hamikdash were the old Levium who were 83 years old and up. They were the Levium that Nebuchadnezzar had expelled from Yerushalayim, who when Nebuchadnezzar commanded Shiru lanu mishir tzion, the Levium bit off their thumbs, so there was no one to sing in the Beis Hamikdash. The young Levium weren't there. The old Levium didn't have thumbs. And therefore, amazingly, the Navi tells us, Ezra penalized the Levium for good. Meiser Rishon is no longer given to the Levium. It's Machlokes who we give it to, the Kohanim, also the Levium, but the Levium were penalized. So ask Reb Chaim Zaychik, who are you penalizing? You're penalizing the old Levium for biting off their thumbs? They sacrificed their limbs not to play for Nebuchadnezzar? How could you penalize the Levium? Says Reb Chaim Zaychik, yes, it was admirable that the Levium could not play for Nebuchadnezzar under any circumstance, but they should not have bit off their thumbs. Biting off their thumbs meant they didn't think that they would survive another 70 years and see one day the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. They gave up hope. The worst crime for a Jew is to give up hope. We're now streaming, so we're going to start all over. So we're going to continue. The Levium were Miyayish. The Levium gave up hope. And a Jew never gives up hope. For giving up hope, the Levium were penalized. They lost Meiser Rishon forever. But we are never Miyayish. Afilu cherev chada munachas al tzavori shel adam al yimna atzmai min harachamim kinavav Shabbos. The most important kinna that we say on Tisha B'Av is kinna Yud Aleph, Vayikoinen Yirmiyah al Yoshiahu. Because the recitation of the kinna was ordained by the Navi Yirmiyah himself. And the Navi tells us in Divrei Hayamim, Beis, Parak Lamed Hey, Vayikoinen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiahu. Vayoimru kol hasharim v'hasharois b'kinoisam al Yosho ad hayom hazeh. All the male singers, all the female singers have always mentioned and lamented Yoshiahu until today. Vayitneim l'choik al Yisrael. They made it a law that whenever there's Jewish tragedy and we mourn the tragedy, we include in it the murder of Yoshiahu HaMelech. So here's rule number one. The more important something is, the more misinterpreted and distorted information you're going to be fed. So ignore what it says in your Kinnus for this Kinnah. Because that's what the Christians say. If you want to know what we say, listen carefully. This is the most distorted Kinnah of the entire corpus of the Kinnus. Number one, we know the story about the greatness of Yoshiahu, The Navi says, "Melachim v'chamay Eloi ha'ilafan melech asher shaval Hashem b'chol liboy b'chol nafshoy b'chol ma'oidoi k'chol Toras Moshe." Gam b'chol malchei Yisrael asher kamu ligdar, we say on the 6th line. From all the Jewish kings that arose to make fences around the Torah, like kam kamayu mimais Avigdar, nobody was like Yoshiahu since the times of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe had 10 names. One of his names was Avigdar. Yoshiahu's grandfather was the wicked Menashe, and he committed his early reign to strip the Jewish people of every vestige of Emunah. He planted in every corner of Eretz Yisrael, including in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, an idol. Menashe did tshuva later in life, but it was too late. We don't like to talk about that, about when it's sometimes too late to do tshuva. But it was too late for Menashe. And then his son took over. Ammon was also an idolater, and he continued to corrupt the region for 2 years. Yoshiahu was only 8 years old when he began to reign over the Jewish people. Can you imagine? You would come into the Beis HaMikdash, and they're sitting on the throne, Ein Yeshiva Ba'azara Ela Lamalchi Beis David Bilvad, an 8-year-old child, wearing the king of Malchus Beis David. Now, in the Kinnus, we say on the 3rd line, Ben Shmoina Shana Heichel Lidrosh Me'aleikav. That's poetic. He wasn't 8 years old when he began to search out Hashem. It was the 8th year of his reign when he began to search out Hashem. But a new king is considered Katan Shenoilad. And in the 18th year of Yoshiahu, something happened that would change the face of Eretz Yisrael forever. Chilkiyahu. Who's Chilkiyahu? Father of Yirmiyah. He's making long overdue repairs in the Beis HaMikdash, and he discovers a Sefer Torah that the Christians would like you to believe, and so would your Kinnus, that this was the only Sefer Torah found in all of Eretz Yisrael. That Menashe and Ammon had so thoroughly eradicated the Torah from Klal Yisrael that there was no Sefer Torah in the Jewish people. Chas v'shalom, to bring such heresy into the Kodesh HaKadoshim of your minds, because that would mean that there was a severance in the tradition of the Torah of Klal Yisrael, which is the worst type of Bible criticism that you could entertain. What was significant was not that they found the Sefer Torah. What was significant was that Sefer Torah that was found. It was the Sefer Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu, says Harav Victor Miller. Awake My Glory, page 305. And where the Sefer Torah was open to the Toichacha, to the Pasuk, Yoylech Hashem Oischa v'yes Malkecha. Not only will God lead out the nation, He will lead out the king as well. Whereupon the Yushalmi says that Yoshiahu tore his clothing. He was so shaken. Says the Yushalmi, Yoshiahu uttered 2 words, Aleinu lahakim. He's going to uphold the Torah. And Yoshiahu went into a nationwide, massive tshuva movement, a great assembly that Klal Yisrael needed to dedicate themselves b'chol levu v'chol nefesh. However, Yoshiahu was somewhat naive into thinking he was successful in eradicating all Avodah Zarah in Klal Yisrael. But we know, Chazal tell us they had a double door system and they hid the Avodah Zarah behind the door. So when the detectives came in to the Jewish home and they said, have you filtered out your Avodah Zarah? They said, sure. Tag it. We have tag filters. No Avodah Zarah over here. And when they opened the door, the Avodah Zarah was hidden behind the door. So Yoshiahu gets word from the king of Egypt, Paro Nechai, who requested passage through Eretz Yisrael, and we're led to believe, why is Paro Nechai going through Eretz Yisrael? He wants to attack Ashur in the north. After all, that's what the pasuk says. It says he went al melech Ashur. But recent archaeology, this I read in the book Uncovering Yirmiyahu, has discovered that Paro Nechai had no intention to go to the north to attack Ashur, but instead there was a big battle going on in Asia Minor at the time between the old king of Assyria and the new and up-and-coming Babylon. And Assyria was crumbling. Nineveh had already been captured, and the king of Assyria was reeling, and Paro Nechai was afraid of Bavel, and therefore Paro Nechai preferred a weak Assyria in the region rather than the strong Babylon, so he was headed to Assyria to bolster Assyrians' effort against Bavel. So Al Melech Ashur means to aid Melech Ashur, and this is corroborated. Josephus writes the same, that Paro Nechai was not going to attack Ashur, but rather to bolster the efforts of Ashur. And Paro Nechai said, do us a favor, we want a safe passageway through Eretz Yisrael. And Yoshiahu Melech, believing that he eradicated Avodah Zarah from the Jewish people, knew that the Torah promised that if we do Ritzonah Shel Makom, no nation will even travel through Eretz Yisrael, even for the sake of peace. So he said, you can't come. You can't travel through our land. And Yoshiahu was looking for a rabbi to ask his shaila to. And he was afraid to ask Yirmiyah, because he knew what Yirmiyah would say. So instead, he asked his question to Chulda Hanaviah. And Chulda Hanaviah, he felt, would have a more sympathetic opinion. And this was Yoshiahu's error. The same error that we encounter today, where people say, yeah, I asked a rabbi. You can't just ask a rabbi. You have to ask a true Talmud Chacham. And Yoshiahu did not do that. And when Yoshiahu denied passage, Paro went out to war against Yoshiahu. And then the Kinnus describes how the Egyptian archers made him samuha kimatara lachitzim. They made Yoshiahu like target practice, and they pierced his holy body with 300 arrows. And this great tzaddik's final words were Tzaddik hu Hashem kipiu marisi. God is righteous, for I have rebelled against him. And the downfall of Yoshiahu ultimately led to the steps that ultimately preceded Churban Bayis Risha and Kino Yud Aleph Vayikoinen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiahu. Kina Tezayin. This Kina, written by the Kalir, Rebbe Lezer HaKalir, speaks about the unspeakable acts that the wicked Titus perpetrated when he entered the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. Of course, Titus was the Roman general who destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash. The siege began by who? Nero Caesar, who ultimately turned around at the last moment. Arak, V'Ozal, V'Agayer, V'Nafak Minei, Rebbe Meir. So Shadar Ilavei, Aspasionos Caesar. And then Aspasionos was promoted to emperor, and he sent his son Titus. And the Gemara tells us in Gittin and Vavam Beis that Titus began his declaration not only with arrogance against the Jewish people and the temple, but against God himself. He shouted, "Ey Elohimai tzur chasayubai." In Avos the Reb Nassan, it relates that when Titus enters the Beis Hamikdash, he pounded the Mizbeach. He said, "Lucas, Lucas, Wolf, Wolf, Ad Melech, Va'ano Melech. You're a king, I'm a king, let's wage war against each other." The Gemara in Gittin relates, Titus grabbed a harlot, took her into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he spread out a Sefer Torah, and in the Holy of Holies, Titus committed the unspeakable Avera. He then slashed the Paroiches, and Hashem made a miracle that blood began to flow forth from the Paroiches. Titus thought, Harag es atzmai, that he had Chas v'shalom killed Kiviyachal. He then took the Paroiches, made a large bundle, and used it to carry away all the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash. By the account of Josephus, 97,000 Jews were taken captive, and the death toll, either by the sword or starvation, was 1.1 million. The Romans minted a special coin for the occasion. On the one side, the head of Vespasian with the victory wreath. I should have it somewhere here. Here we go. This is the coin. It's worth a lot of money. Vespasian is garlanded with the victory wreath, and it says on the other side, Judea Capta, which is a machlokes haposkim what Judea Capta means. Most think it means Judea Capta, Judah is captive, but for you Latin experts out there, many say Judea Capta, Capta milashon kaput. Judea is finished. And they carried all the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash back to Rome. And one of the most dramatic scenes in Imperial Rome is the Arch of Titus, which is a huge monument that's been erected, engraved the scenes of the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash being plundered. And our consolation is that while the Roman Empire has crumbled, if you want to see the Roman Empire, you go to the British Museum and you could see a coffee mug where the bottom part of the handle, they claim, was the frappuccino that Titus, his shivcha Kinnus, once washed out. That's the only relic that remains from the Roman Empire. And here we are today, thriving. Yeshivas are being built, and institutions all over the world. The Kinnah begins, Zechar asher asat sar bifnim. Remember what the tormentor did in the Beis Hamikdash. Shalaf charba yuba lifnai v'lifnim. He unleashed his sword, and he came into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Nachalasenu bies ketime lechem apanim. He struck terror throughout the land as he defiled the showbread. V'gadar paroiches balas shtepanim. He pierced the curtain that had two sides. The paroiches was embroidered in a way where the image on one side was different than the image on the other side, says Yoshiahu. If you go to the bottom line, the Mekaynein laments the challenging question: why, when Nadav Avihu brought a strange fire into the Mishkan, these holy tzaddikim were punished by bolts of fire coming down immediately, entering their nostrils, consuming their innards, and yet when the evil Titus committed the unspeakable, what happened to him? Nothing happened to him. How could such a thing be? Avoseinu zara kehechnisai bachurav achla eish. Our forefathers, when they brought in a foreign fire, they were consumed by fire. And this brought in a despicable harlot. But the answer is very simple, Rachamim. Let's say we were gathered to hear a shiur about the Kinnus, and the wire is not plugged in. So then the only people that could hear it are the people present. But when you plug in the wire, then all of a sudden, the message could travel. That's the difference between Titus and a Jew. Titus, he's a Gentile. So whatever he does, it's just basar v'dam. He's not plugged into the system. But a Jew is plugged into the universe. Every word, thought, action, even the genesis of a thought that begins in the klayos affects the cosmos. So Titus could be mezaneh in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It has no effect. But a Jew allows an impure thought to enter their mind that is more catastrophic even than what Titus did. Every morning the Kohanim would remove how many vessels? 93 vessels. Every single day they would take out 93 vessels. Look at page 228 on the 6th line. Oirenu namek kehishkim mishares. Our flesh melted when the mishares woke up early. V'loy matzah tishim u'shloisha klei shares. They could not find the 93 Klishares. Go to page 228. Sorim lufasu kevai paretz. The Alkut Shemani tells us that there are malachim, and then when the Jews were admonished that they better change their ways, otherwise they'll face disasters, they were not afraid. We're going to say the names of malachim, we'll call on the malach of ice and fire and lightning, and they'll defend us. They'll protect us. But Chazal said that on that fateful day, the malachim changed their names and changed their jobs. So when we summoned the malachim cringed because they can no longer help us. Take a look at the 13th line. V'saru ki yuzak b'shishim riboy mazikim. They thought Titus would be injured by the 600,000 demons. Medrash Rabbah says that when the Romans came to destroy the Beis Hamikdash, 600,000 demons awaited at the gates to destroy them. By the way, that's a lot of demons. And they were about to attack Titus, and the demon said if God himself had withdrew his power and he does not interfere, then we cannot interfere. I'm sure you know the well-known account of the Panovich Rav, Rav Shlomo Kahanaman, when he went to Italy to raise funds for the yeshivas, and he asked Rothschild to take him to the Arch of Titus, and the Panovich Rav addressed Titus, and he famously said, Mir zen da, avu zentir, we are here. Where are you, Titus? So if I may, I would like to add a personal Arch of Titus story. Everyone should have their own personal Arch of Titus story. A few years ago, we had the opportunity to stand at the Arch of Titus. And I went together with my father, Glatstein, and Yehuda Glatstein. And 72 years earlier, when the war was coming to an end, and the Nazis had to make the decision, should they try to win the war? And instead they dedicated all their resources to exterminate whatever Jews were still left in the camps. My grandfather, Sechet Hag Levracha, included. And they packed whatever Jews were still left in the camps onto cattle cars, where they were headed to the Tyrol Mountains in Italy to dig their own graves. And then 72 years later, I'm standing at the Arch of Titus. 3 generations, my father, my son, and I turn to the right, and who's standing next to us? Teddy Lackman. Who's Teddy Lackman? Teddy Lackman is the son of Meyer Lackman. One Pesach, came into the shul when I was a bachar, to the Agudah of Avenue L, and into the shul, I was standing next to my grandfather, into the shul comes Meyer Lackman. And Meir Lackman turns to me and says, your Zayda, he knows how to daven. I think, no kidding, he knows how to daven. Of course he knows how to daven. He said, no, you don't understand what I mean that he knows how to daven. In the death camps, he would be saying Tehillim, he would be davening the Shemana Esrei, and the Nazi would come and club him over the head, and he would fall down in a pool of blood unconscious. And then a day later he would get up, he would dust himself off, he would brush himself off, and he would continue where he was up to in the Tehillim, in the Shemana Esrei, as if nothing happened. That's what I mean when I say that this Yid knows how to daven. And here we are, 72 years later. The descendants of my grandfather, the descendants of Meir Lackman, and we're standing there under the Arch of Titus, 3 generations. Va'ani zois brisi oisam amar Hashem, ruchi asher alecha, udvarai asher samti beficha, lo yamushu mipicha umipi zaracha v'zara zaracha, amar Hashem e'atov yad olam. And I too cannot help but think, Titus Harasha, who has had the last laugh. But we know when Titus pierced the paroiches, Hashem made a miracle. And blood began gushing forth from the paroiches. And Rabbi Isaac Sher asks, why would God make a miracle to trick Titus into thinking that Titus killed Kiviyachal? What's the purpose of this miracle? And Rabbi Isaac Sher explains that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not making a miracle for Titus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was making a miracle for the Jewish people. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was teaching the Jewish people that Yerushalayim, that Sion, that the Beis HaMikdash is Beis Chayenu. It's the heart of Klal Yisrael. And if Titus is destroying the Beis HaMikdash, then the world is suffering cardiac arrest. Then it's like a dagger in the heart of the Jewish people. Like we say in the bracha of the Haftarah, Rachem al Tzion, Kihi Beis Chayenu, Kino Tezayin, Zechar Asher Asa Tsar Bifnim. One of the most dramatic highlights of Tisha B'Av is Kina Chaf Aleph, Arzei Halavanayin, depicting the brutal murder of the Asara Harugei Malchus, the 10 martyrs, 10 great Tanoim who were murdered by the Romans. And these 10 Tanoim were not all murdered at the same time. This is not meant as a historical account. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol did not even live at the same time as the other 8. But the purpose of the Kinnah is to be Ma'orer, Avelus, and Shuva. Now on Yom Kippur we read another piyut about the Asar Harugei Malchus. On Yom Kippur we read Eila Ezkara, and we understand on Yom Kippur why we read the Eila Ezkara, because the Gemara tells us in Ma'id Katan Daf Chavches, Lamanismecha, Misas, Miriam, the Parshas Para Aduma, Loimar Lecha, Ma Para Aduma Mechaperes, Af Misas, Tzadikim Mechaperes. So we understand why we read about the death of the Tzadikim on Yom Kippur. But why do we read about the death of the Asara Harugei Malchus on Tisha B'Av? The simple answer is, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says on Yerches Amud Beis, Shkula Misa Sadikim Kisreifas Beis Alekeinu. I would like to share with you a thought that just occurred to me. There are many tragedies that happen throughout Jewish history that we don't talk about on Tisha B'Av. We don't speak about the Chmielnicki pogroms. There's no mention of them. Tens of thousands of Jews were brutalized in Tachvatat 1648, 1649. How many Kinnus do we have about them? None. How many words do we say about them? We don't talk about them at all. Why not? I will quote to you what Rabbi Soloveitchik writes. I do not know why there are no Kinnus recited on Tisha B'Av, which commemorate the Chmielnicki persecutions. That's his kasha. Why don't we talk about Chmielnicki? Now, in the past, we answered this question based on Rav Moshe, but I'm going to tell you a new answer this year. Rav Moshe asks an opposite question. Rav Moshe wants to know, why do we have a day of fasting, the 20th day of Sivan, for the Chmielnicki pogroms, and we don't have a day of fasting for the Holocaust? That's Rav Moshe's kasha. And Rav Moshe answers that we don't have to have a separate day of fasting for the Holocaust. The Holocaust is subsumed in Tisha B'Av, just like the Crusades are subsumed in Tisha B'Av. But the Chmielnicki pogroms, says Rav Moshe, are not subsumed in Tisha B'Av. Why? So Rav Moshe, there's a very big difference between the Holocaust, the Crusades, and the Chmielnicki pogroms. Anytime there's Jewish tragedy perpetrated by the reigning power, the government, that's a result of Churban Beis HaMikdash. So the Jewish people have no autonomy, we have no sovereignty. So our sovereignty has been given over to the Roman Empire, and in our times it's America, and in the past it's been the Crusaders, or Germany, or Hitler. So whenever atrocity is perpetrated by the reigning government, that's a direct result as the Churban, and we don't mourn for it on any other day but Tisha B'Av. It's subsumed in Tisha B'Av. But says Rav Moshe, the Chmielnicki pogroms were not perpetrated by the reigning government. They were anti-government, anti-police, anti-establishment. So when it's anti-establishment, it's not related to the Churban. So therefore it has to be commemorated on a different day. According to that, why do we commemorate the Asara Harugei Malchus? Because that was perpetrated by the Roman government. The following approach just hit me. Part of it last night and part of it right now. The Nesivos HaMishpat writes in his commentary to Eicha that there is no tachlis in people sitting on the floor crying over past tragedy. Does it make you feel good to sit on the floor, not to eat, not to drink? Are you comfortable on the floor? I mean, we don't have carpet over here. Most shuls don't have carpet. Most shuls have marble, so we have wood, so it's a little bit more comfortable. You like sitting on the floor crying? Is that going to do anything for the Jewish people? Somebody who was slaughtered 50 years ago, is he feeling more comfortable now that you're crying? Those who were massacred in times of Churban Beis HaMikdash, are they getting some kind of aliyah because you're afflicting yourself? It says in the Nesivos, mourning has no tachlis at all. Unless we delve into the reason why these tragedies occurred. And we identify what the chait was. And we think about how we could correct it. So that means if the tachlis of saying the Kinnus is not just to mourn Jewish tragedy, but to identify the cause of Jewish tragedy, one would reasonably assume that we need to identify tragedies that are parallel to Churban Beis HaMikdash, not random tragedies that were caused by Chatoim, not related to Churban Beis HaMikdash. So I would humbly suggest, would there be any tachlis in talking about Tach V'Tat on Tisha B'Av? Now, Tach V'Tat was a terrible disaster and atrocity. But what was the reason for Tach V'Tat? What caused it? So we know the Tosfos Yom Tif made a She'elas Chaloim, and he saw that the reason for the Gzeros of 1648, 1649 were because people were talking by Chazar Sashatz and people were talking by davening. I'm not a fan of talking by davening, if you haven't known that by now. But that is not relevant to Tisha B'Av. What does the chait of Devarim, B'Teilim, B'Shas HaTfilah have to do with Tisha B'Av? That's an Avera. It's mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. We have to be very careful about it. We could focus on it any time. But Tach V'Tat is not relevant to Tisha B'Av because the Siba, the cause of the tragedy, is not a similar cause to Churban Beis HaMikdash. Not relevant to Churban Beis HaMikdash. But the Asara Harugei Malchus, that's very relevant to Churban Beis HaMikdash. Because what was the reason for the Asara Harugei Malchus? Mechiras Yosef. Sinas Chinam. There's no better day a year to mourn the Asara Harugei Malchus than on Tisha B'Av. You want to know what Sinas Chinam is? You want to know the repercussions of Sinas Chinam? You want to know the generational effect of Sinas Chinam? Yosef was sold by his brothers, so these 10 tzaddikim had to come back as Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol and Rabbi Hanan ben Tradion, and they had to be murdered by the Romans. Why? Sinas Chinam. That's very relevant to Tisha B'Av. There's no more appropriate day to discuss the effects of Mechiras Yosef than Tisha B'Av. This is not just another Jewish tragedy. This is the heart of, this is the cause of it all. That is perhaps why we mourn the Asara Harugei Malchus on Tisha B'Av. The Kinnus begins. Arzei haLevanoin Adirei HaTorah. Cedars of Lebanon. Adirei HaTorah, giants of Torah. Tzaddikim are compared to cedar trees. Like we say, Tzaddik, Katamar Yifrach, Ke'erez Ba'Levanon Yiskeh. Balei Tresin, shield bearers. Interesting. Talmidei Chachamim are called shield bearers, not sword bearers. Why? Rav Kook writes, and the Chassam Sofer says a very similar idea in Parashat Shoftim, that the job of a Talmid Chacham is not to impose their outlook on others, but when they are attacked, they have to be able to defend themselves. That's why they're called shield bearers. The Mishnah of a Gemara, in the learning of Mishnayos and learning of Gemara, Giborei Koyach, powerful warriors, Amaleha b'tahara, who toil in purity. Learning Torah is different than any other intellectual pursuit. Other disciplines are dependent on intellectual capacity. But Torah requires siyata d'shmaya, requires amelos. The Kinnus goes on to depict how they brought Reb Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, and they each begged the executioner, kill me first, so I don't have to bear to see the death of my beloved colleague. And the executioner was so overwhelmed, he decided to cast lots. Look on the 10th line, Yadu Goyrol, Mirisha in Lacherev Berura. They cast lots to see who would be put to the sword first. Kinafayel Goyrol Arabim Shimon, Pashat Savara Yubacha Kinigzra Gzeira. When the lot fell out on Reb Shimon, he stretched out his neck and he cried when the decree was issued. Reb Shimon Gamliel was the Nasi, was the great-grandson of Hillel, was the direct descendant of David HaMelech. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Siman Nun Gimel Sivkat Lamed Hey, in the name of the Sefer Chasidim, that when Reb Shimon Gamliel was being carried out to be killed, he asked Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, my dear brother, why am I being taken out to be killed as a criminal? I don't have any averos on my record. And Rabbi Shmuel replied, maybe one time when you were lecturing to the masses, your heart felt a certain personal pleasure. You benefited improperly from the Torah. And Rabbi Shimon replied, Achi nichamtani, my dear brother, you've comforted me, you've provided rationale for why I'm experiencing this. If you look on the bottom line, Mizera Aharon, Sha'al b'vakasha, livkois al ben hagvira. The progeny of Aaron, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol, requested to be able to cry over the son of Reb Shimon. Not al roishai unesanei al arkuvoisav. He took the severed head of Reb Shimon and he placed it on his lap. By the way, there's a big question. A kohen could take the head of a mess and put it on his lap? I believe I saw over Shabbos that there's a halacha that a kohen is allowed to be matame to the nasi. To the nasi, all of Klal Yisrael are considered avelav. So Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol could take the head of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Not loy roishay u'nesani ala kubaysav. He took the head of Rabbi Shimon and he placed it on his lap. Menorah hatahira, O pure menorah. Some einav al einav upiv al piv. By the way, in light of our introduction to Kinnus, where a person's einayim are the menorah, we understand the hemshech. Menorah hatahira some einav al einav. The menorah is a reference to the holy eyes of Reb Shimon Gamliel. Ana v'omar peh hamizgaber b'Torah, mouth that strengthened itself in Torah. Pisaim niknesa alav misa meshuna, suddenly is being afflicted with a cruel death. The Mekaynen then relates that they then turned to Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol and they ordered to skin the skin of his head with a sharp razor. And as they tore the skin off his head, Rabbi Shmuel did not make a peep. He did not cry. How could such a thing be? How could somebody withstand such torture? But we know the Maram Rothenburg taught his student, the Tashbates, when the Maram was imprisoned in Einsheim, one of the halachas he taught the Tashbates is that when a person gives up their life al Kiddush Hashem, they don't feel any pain. It's a haftacha. It's a special gift min hashamayim. One does not feel any pain. Ad kedei kach, the Rabbi Yosef Engel asks. So then, Rabbi Akiva, what was the great mile of Rabbi Akiva, that they were sorik b'sar b'masveko shel barza, and the Talmidim said, even now? What do you mean? Person doesn't feel anything. B'shas Kiddush Hashem. Like we see, Rabbi Shmuel. But says the Kinnus, Rasha, HaPoishet, when the wicked man stretched out his hand, Eis higia l'makoim tefillin mitzvahs bara, when they reached the brilliant mitzvah of tefillin, Tzaka, Rabbi Shmuel, Kohen Gadol, let out a cry, Minizdaza oilam ve'eretz ispoirera. The world shaked and the earth crumbled. Rabbi Shmuel was able to contain his own personal pain. But when he realized that this would be the last time he would ever be able to fulfill the precious mitzvah of tefillin, he cried out in great suffering. By the way, the Ramah Mipano reveals that Yoshiahu HaMelech was a Gilgal, that Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol was the Gilgal of Yoshiahu HaMelech. The Mekoinen then laments the torturous murder of Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara in Brachos tells us that Rabbi Akiva was imprisoned and sentenced for teaching Torah publicly, and they took Rabbi Akiva out to be killed at the time of Kriya Shema. By the way, it was Kriya Shema Shel Arvis, not Kriya Shema Shel Shachris. Look on the 9th line on page 250. Me'acharav Hevius Rabbi Akiva. Afterward, they brought up Rabbi Akiva. This was 60 years after the Churban. Rabbi Akiva at the time was 120 years old. Rabbi Akiva's penetrating analysis could uproot mountains and grind them together. They combed off his flesh with iron combs to break him. Yatzisa nishmasai be'echad. His soul departed as he was saying the word echad of Kriya Shema. The Gemara tells us, Ki alecha hiragnu kol hayom. Is that Kriya Shema? That the Jewish people are killed for the sake of God every day. This refers to Shema. What does this mean? This refers to Shema. Says the Shulchan Aruch that when one says the Kriya Shema, one needs to say Shema be'ema uve'yira uve'reses uve'zeya. You know that halacha? It's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch that when you say Shema, it needs to be be'ema uve'yira be'reses uve'zeya. Why do you have to get so worked up when you say Shema? Why do you need to shake and trepidate? And why are you so anxious when you say Shema? Says the Tshuvas Harashba, quoted by Mishnah Brura. When one says Shema, they are required to imagine that they are giving up their life al Kiddush Hashem, b'skila, b'sreifa, b'hereg, uvechenek. This is not a nice thing to do. This is not like a hidur mitzvah. This is a halacha psuka. That when you say Shema, you're required to imagine giving up your life al Kiddush Hashem. This is not a chumrah, a hidur. It's a seif in Shulchan Aruch. HaKorei Kriya Shema, chayiv likrois, be'ema, be'yira, be'reses, uvezeya. In fact, one of the students of Ramah Mipano says that when you say Shema with the right kavanah, it's mechaper all your averos. Because if you're thinking you're experiencing the Daled Misois Bezdin, so it's like you experienced it. By the way, he writes, the student of the Ramami Pano, something which is Oyam V'Noira. He says, we know that an Ani is Chashiv Kames. We know that a blind person is Chashiv Kames. So if somebody is tempted to look at something inappropriate, and one closes their eyes to it, so you're even less than a blind person, because a blind person can't see. You're able to see and you're closing your eyes and you're making yourself a summa. You're chashiv kameis. It's mechaper all your averos. If you're maharer b'tshuva, you're walking down the street and you say, okay, I'm going to turn away, and you render yourself a summa, it's mechaper all your averos. Likewise, one who says Kriya Shema and imagines that they would give up their life al Kiddush Hashem, it's mechaper all your averos. Rabbi Akiva was asked by his Talmidim, even now you're able to say Shema when your life is being taken away? So you know what Rabbi Akiva said? My whole life, every time I said Shema, I envisioned I was giving my life up al Kiddush Hashem. That was my kavanah every time I said Shema. So now that I have the opportunity, I'm not going to say the Shema. That was my kavanah every time I said the Kriya Shema. During World War I, Reb David Povarsky, later become Rosh Yeshiva Panovich, was in a situation where the only way to escape the enemy is he would have to hide out in an outhouse. And he didn't take up the opportunity. So people asked him, how could you not save your life? V'chai bohem. You have to go into the bathroom to save your life. And Reb David Povarsky, I couldn't do it. Because from time immemorial, a Jew always gives up their life saying Shema Yisrael. If I would be in the outhouse, I would not be able to say the Shema. I couldn't bring myself to do that. Kina Chaf Aleph Arzei Alavanon Adirei HaTorah.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.